Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa ashabihi wa man tabi'ahum bi isanin ila yawmiddin wa ba'd. Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu ittaqullaha haqqa tuqatihi wa la tamutunna illa wa antum muslimun. My dear brothers and sisters in Islam, as you know, Ramadan is quickly approaching. We are less than 10 days or so away from starting the month. And when we look at the month of Ramadan, we will find that there is a very wide spectrum of experiences that you and I can have during that month. On one end of the spectrum, the very positive end of that spectrum, there's revitalization of our faith. There's a renewal of worship, the spirit of Islam, and of course there is spiritual growth and benefits to be had. There's character, reformation. There's a connection that we rekindle with the Quran. We seek Allah's forgiveness and, inshallah, are pardoned of our sins, and there is reward that can be obtained throughout that month. On this side of the spectrum, Ramadan is a very precious time. Ramadan can be a very special time. Every single moment is an opportunity to be taken advantage of. Nothing will go to waste for someone who sees Ramadan in this light. They welcome the month. They're excited by its beginning. And then when they bid it farewell, it's a moment, of course, which is bittersweet. This is one end of the spectrum. And the other end, which would be the losing end of the spectrum, is an end which is basically hunger and thirst. It's headaches, it's weariness, it's being tired during the day. There's a fixation on the clock, watching, waiting, counting down, not for the beginning of the month, but for the next meal, looking forward to eating. Time is wasted on this end of the spectrum on seasonal TV programming, what's often called Ramadaniyat or something of that nature. The series that are produced just for the month of Ramadan, often taking hours of our time to consume such content. There's a lot of social media that goes on. There's idle talk and conversations that are filled in that time. Some may even sleep the day away entirely, missing out on obligatory prayers throughout that month. On this side of the spectrum, Ramadan, it's not precious, but it's like any other month. It might even be worse for some than any other month because they're being deprived of that food and drink, missing out on many meals, breakfast, lunch, coffee, snack, etc. Opportunities are lost. The month, it may feel like a burden. It's very difficult to get through. And when it's time to bid that month farewell, it is a very happy time. Not because worship has been concluded, but because now we can stop and finish this arduous task. These two ends of the spectrum are described by the Prophet ﷺ in two very distinct, very well-known hadith. And they highlight the difference between the two ends. Basically, the difference between when he said, "Man sama Ramadana imanan wahtisaba, ghufira lahu ma taqaddama min dhanbi." This is one hadith you find muttafaqun alayhi, Sahih al-Bukhari and Muslim. The Prophet ﷺ said, whoever fasts in full faith, in anticipation for the reward, then they will be pardoned of the previous sins. And then the other hadith, he says, رُبَّ صَائِمٍ حَظَّهُ مِنْ صِيَامِهِ الْجُوعُ وَالْعَطَشُ وَرُبَّ قَائِمٍ حَظَّهُ مِنْ قِيَامِهِ السَّهَرِ. This other hadith were found in numerous collections like Imam Ahmad's Musnad. The Prophet ﷺ was reported to have said that there may be those who fast, and the only thing they get out of their fast is hunger and thirst. And there may be those that stand in prayer, and the only thing they achieve from that prayer is fatigue. That's it, just going through the motions, the exercise of withholding, restraining from eating, and then standing in long moments of prayer. We have to decide now. It's the time. If you haven't already decided yet, now's the time to make the decision on what end of the spectrum you want your Ramadan experience to be. You have to ask yourself, what type of Ramadan do I want this year? Think about the Ramadan you had last year. How did it go? Which side of the spectrum was it on? Was it somewhere in the middle? Think about how you could perhaps improve upon what you experienced last year. And I'm sure each and every one of us would agree there's always some room for improvement. And so to make your Ramadan a positive experience, maybe the best experience you've had yet, it's important to set a number of goals. You have to have goals before the month even begins. And to set goals, you have to understand the nature of fasting, the nature of the month. And to help us understand that, we have to turn to one of the greats, one of the mountains, if you will, of our tradition, one of the saints and scholars, Imam al-Ghazali, rahimahullah ta'ala. He's divided fasting into three different types, three different categories. Whereas I said there's two ends to the spectrum, there's kind of three different types of fasting that people will go through. The first of those is the physical act. The physical act is important. There's no doubt about that. It's legislated. It's an obligation to withhold from eating and drinking, etc. The physical act, along with its very specific rulings, must be adhered to for the fast to be valid. In order for your Ramadan to count, you have to do these things. And this is what's considered the general fast, the fast of the masses. He says, أَمَّا صَوْمُ الْعُمُومِ فَهُوَ كَفَّ الْبَطْنِ وَالْفَرْجِ عَنْ قَضَاءِ الشَّهْوَةِ. Basically, that the general fast of the masses is that you refrain from satisfying your hunger and sensual desires. We all know that. We don't eat or drink. We don't spend intimate moments with our spouse during the daylight of Ramadan. And this is where the general masses of people will stop. They'll do this and that's it. It's a physical, mechanical way to achieve or to fulfill the obligation. It could be similar to the intermittent fasting that many people do today for dietary reasons. Just not eating or drinking. According to one of the greats, Imam Rajab, he said that based on various reports from the pious predecessors, those that came before, he said that this is the easiest type of fasting. It's the easiest one. This is like the beginner level, level 1. You're at ground level with fasting, avoiding food and drink. And while they're fasting from food and drink, many people in this category are often spiritually reckless. Spiritually, it could be a disaster. And there's a story that was related by a number of the great scholars of hadith like Imam al-Bayhaqi, Imam Ahmad. The story has to do with two women that fasted during the time of the Prophet ﷺ. So while they're fasting, a man came to the Prophet ﷺ and he said that these two women, they're fasting and they're about to die of thirst. They're fasting and they're about to die of thirst. And the Prophet ﷺ initially, he ignored the man. He ignored the issue. He came back and he said, "Oh messenger, these women, they've either died or they're about to die." And so the Prophet ﷺ ordered that the women come in front of him. And when they came, he brought a bowl out. And he told one of them to vomit into the bowl, as if, she's having some reaction to the fast. And she vomited, and out came blood and pus, filled half of the bowl up. And then he told the other woman to do the same thing, and she did. And out came blood and pus and flesh and fresh meat and other things, and it filled the entire bowl. And then he said that the two women, they fasted from what Allah permitted for them, meaning they fasted from their food and drink, what is typically permissible for them to do, but then they broke their fast with what Allah has prohibited them from. One of them went to the other and they began consuming the flesh of people. While they're fasting, one went and started to backbite and to gossip about people. That's the one that vomited up the flesh and the meat, etc., eating the flesh of another person. See, while they were going through the mechanical aspect of not eating and drinking, which is typically permissible, they gorged themselves on the flesh of others by backbiting. So they stayed away from these things which are typically permissible, and then, of course, they engaged in sin and wickedness. This is how a person can be spiritually reckless while not eating or drinking. And so they fulfilled the basic physical elements or the function of fasting, but they missed out on the desired result, one of the aims of fasting, and that is to abstain from sin. It's to abstain from sin. I mean, you're leaving things which are typically halal so that you might be more cautious with things that are typically haram. And this is where reformation of character comes in as one of the loftier objectives of fasting. And this is what Imam al-Ghazali calls the fast of the minority. Amma sawm al-khusus, he says the fast of the minority فَهُوَ كَفُّ السَّمْعِ وَالْبَصَرِ وَاللِّسَانِ وَالْيَدِ وَالرِّجْلِ وَسَائِرِ الْجَوَارِحِ عَنِ الْآثَامِ, which basically means that the fast of the minority is to keep the ears, the eyes, the tongue, the hands, the feet, and all remaining limbs away from sin. And this is the reality of what faith-based fasting or faith-enriched fasting looks like. I mean, what's the difference between the popular intermittent fasting and the fasting that we're going to be doing, just mechanically? One's doing the same thing as the other. The spiritual part of it, the inner dimension of it is how you are carrying yourself. What it is that you're not doing. What it is that you're staying away from. This fast is much more than just about the food and the drink. And this is what the Prophet ﷺ had to say about the spirit of fasting. He says, لَيْسَ الصِّيَامُ مِنَ الْأَكْلِ وَالشُّرْبِ. He says, fasting is not about food and drink. إِنَّمَا الصِّيَامُ مِنَ اللَّغْوِ وَالرَّفَثِ فَإِنْ سَابَكَ أَحَدٌ أَوْ جَهِلَ عَلَيْكَ فَلْتَقُلْ إِنِّي صَائِمٌ إِنِّي صَائِمٌ. He said, fasting, not about food and drink, but it's about refraining from vain speech and obscenity. If someone were to curse you or accost you, you say, I'm fasting, I'm fasting. You can find another narration in Musannaf ibn Abi Shayba, Umar ibn Khattab. He said that لَيْسَ الصِّيَامُ مِنَ الطَّعَامِ وَالشَّرَابِ وَحْدَ. He said that fasting is not staying away from food and drink only, وَلَكِنَّهُ مِنَ الْكَذِبِ وَالْبَاطِلِ وَاللَّغْوِ وَالْحَلَفِ. But fasting is to stay away from lying, from falsehood, from vain speech, and making false oaths. Again, the Prophet ﷺ, one of his great companions, Umar ibn Khattab, highlighting to us what it means to fast, at least the fast of the minority. This means that the physical act of fasting, that mechanical part of not eating or drinking, what it's doing is helping us set the stage for a much greater type of fast in which we're not fixated on the food and the drink, but we're focused on our character, on making positive changes, on reformation of the character. We're staying away from the sins of the eye and the mouth, meaning looking at and observing things which are impermissible to see, not listening to things which are haram, not speaking things, using words or language or breaking covenants and oaths and promises. And then, of course, our hands and our feet by not engaging in that which is impermissible while we're fasting. If you can obtain this, if you can achieve this in your Ramadan, then you should consider your fast something very special. This type of Ramadan is very special. Al-Ghazali, he said this is Sawm al-Khusus. This is the minority. Khusus is special, khas, is something that's very precious. If you can do this in your Ramadan, you've just had an amazing Ramadan. You weren't fixated on food and drink. You were thinking about becoming a better Muslim. The outward acts of fasting, of course, as I said, you have to do them. They're very important, and they have to be done according to our legislation. But those outward acts serve as a means to achieving a higher objective. And the loftiest of those objectives is taqwa. It is to obtain some level of piety. This is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands in the Quran in Surah Al-Baqarah, verse number 183. يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا كُتِبَ عَلَيْكُمُ الصِّيَامُ كَمَا كُتِبَ عَلَى الَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِكُمْ لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ. Very famous verse in the Quran. O you who believe, fasting has been prescribed for you as it was prescribed for those that came before you, so that you may obtain taqwa. This is the ultimate objective, to obtain taqwa. Great scholars, they talk about this in detail. We go back to Ibn Rajab again. He said that the essence of taqwa, this is very powerful, by the way, his description of what this word means. It's often translated as the fear of Allah or the awe or the God consciousness. It just doesn't quite embody the meaning as he does right here. He says that taqwa is placing a barrier between you and what you fear. It's like a shield of sorts. And he says the servant therefore places a barrier between himself and what he fears from his Lord, what he fears from Allah. And that is the punishment, the torment, and the agony that would await a sinner in the hereafter. And that barrier, that shield, it includes two things: righteous deeds and refraining and avoiding sin. That's the barrier. He went on and he says that complete taqwa is described to the degree of refraining from the slightest of sin to the point that you're willing to leave off something halal to create an even greater barrier between you and that which is haram. To abandon that which is halal, to avoid what may eventually turn into something that is haram. Like those long-winded conversations, those late-night conversations that you're just hanging out and relaxing, and the conversations are fine, they're halal, it's no problem, it's great to talk, it's a blessing to be able to share what's on our mind and express our feelings to one another. But sometimes, oftentimes, we know that the longer that we talk, the more likely we are to run into conversations that are sinful. We run out of positive things to say, and then, well, you know how it goes. It can spiral out of control, and the next thing you know, you're gorging yourself on the flesh of someone else, backbiting and gossiping, lying, excessive joking, etc. So you might leave off those conversations and minimize those things, leaving the halal so that you're that much further away from committing the haram. And that's what Ramadan shows us. Think about it. This is what Ramadan represents. It's a moment in our life, a month out of the year in which we refrain from the things that are traditionally, typically halal, so that we're that much further away from the haram. You need to think to yourself, how can I commit a sin while I'm not eating the halal, tayyib things that Allah has given for me? How can I live such a contradiction in Ramadan, where I'm sinning while I'm not eating and drinking this halal? Typically, in Ramadan, of course, it's not halal to eat and drink during the daylight hours, but typically it's fine. It's a terrible contradiction that we have to wrestle with every time the month comes around. And when we do wrestle with that, it's a conscious choice that we have to make throughout the day. And that choice is one that's made with your heart and not your head. Because many of us know the right thing. The choices that we make with our head, we know the right thing to do. The problem is we find ourselves not doing it. We find ourselves not doing the right thing. We know what the right thing is. The knowledge is there. It's just sometimes we're not acting in that way. Because the choice is made in the heart. That's where taqwa resides. Those decisions are based on taqwa. The Prophet ﷺ, he says, "At-taqwa hahuna." He said that taqwa is here. وَيَشِيرُ إِلَى صَدْرِ. He was pointing to his chest. That piety is there. And so the faithful, they should always be giving more attention to what's inside than what is on the outside. Should focus not on what knowledge, the little tidbits of information that you possess, so much as you should be focusing on the condition of your spirit. The condition of your spirit and how it molds your character. Approaching Ramadan in this light will help us answer that question, which is, I know what the right thing to do is. Why am I not doing it? I know the right decision. Why am I not making it? The answer lies right here. As the Prophet ﷺ said. And this is what leads us to the last level of fasting. The pinnacle of fasting, as Imam al-Ghazali, he says, وَأَمَّا صَوْمُ خُصُوصَ الْخُصُوصِ, which is like the 1% of the 1%. It's like the most special type of fast. It's the elite. فَصَوْمُ الْقَلْبِ عَنَ الصِّفَاتِ الدَّنِيَّةِ وَالْأَفْكَارِ الدُّنْيَوِيَّةِ وَكَفُّهُ عَمَّا سِوَى اللَّهِ عَزَّ وَجَلَّ بِالْكُلِّيَّةِ. He says this is the fast of the elite. It's the fast of the heart. The fast of the heart. It abstains from lowly qualities like envy and hatred, conceit, hypocrisy, arrogance, laziness, hastiness, anger, and of course ego. The heart is fasting from those things. And it also fasts from worldly thoughts like fame and fortune, leadership, lust, desire, etc. And it refrains entirely from everything but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He says that this fast of the heart is broken by thinking about anything other than Allah and the last day. It's also broken by thinking about worldly things, unless those worldly things serve your faith. There are many things in our life, with the right intention, they become avenues, mediums of good deeds. But without the right intention, it's just some worldly issue. Some of the spiritual masters of the past, they said, whoever's aspiration during the day is to figure out what they're going to eat to break their fast is a sin for them. For the spiritual masters, that is. He's not talking about the average, everyday, the umum, right? The general people. But for someone who is spiritually developed, has reached a high capacity of spiritual awareness, this is a sin for them. They're worried about, what are we having for iftar? Did we get the kebabs yet? Did we get the samosas yet? What do we have? Because it's not Ramadan without those cheese or beef samosas, or it's not the same. They're not thinking about that at all. If they thought about that, that's like the heart, the fast of the heart is broken, and it's a sin. Because it indicates a lack of trust in Allah's provision for someone who is spiritually developed. It's a lack of certainty in His promised provision. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala promised provision for all of the believers. And this was the type of fast of the Prophet ﷺ. It's the fast of all the prophets, the faithful and the pious. And as impossible as this type of fast might seem, it's certainly the fast that we should all be striving to have in the coming month. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم ولسائر المسلمين من كل ذنب فاستغفروه إنه هو الغفور الرحيم. بسم الله والحمد لله حمدا كثيرا طيبا مباركا فيه كما يحب ربنا ويرضاه ونصلي ونسلم على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله وقولوا قولا سديدا يصلح لكم أعمالكم ويغفر لكم ذنوبكم ومن يطع الله ورسوله فقد فاز فوزا عظيما. Brothers and sisters, the righteous that came before us, they had a very special relationship with Ramadan. I would say incredibly special connection to the month. One might go so far as to say there was a fixation about Ramadan for them. They were fixated on the month to the point that it's been said they would pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala 6 months before Ramadan that they would be able to live and to see that month through to the end. And then the following months after that, they would pray that Allah accepted that Ramadan. Meaning Ramadan was on their mind the entire year. Every day of the year there was a thought of that month. You'll find that many, including the companions, had unique routines that they would live by during Ramadan. And these routines were routines which included increased prayers, recitation of the Quran, sometimes completing it many, many times. Some of them would complete the Quran at least once a day, sitting and reciting, praying. An onlooker, especially today, an onlooker might see that and think that, you know what, they're living out their last days. This is someone who knows they're about to die. If you've ever asked yourself that question, or someone asked you, if you knew you were going to die tomorrow, what would you do today? When you look at them during Ramadan, this was their habit. This was their daily ritual. It would appear as if they were about to die. And so they were spending their last days in fervorous worship. It was as if everything was riding on those precious moments. Everything that they could accomplish just in that month would be the tail end of their lives, and that would be it. This type of routine, this type of action, this type of connection requires a great deal of attention. It requires a great deal of intentionality. You can't float through Ramadan and achieve these types of goals. You have to be very, very keen on what it is that you're trying to achieve. And without that keenness, without that attention, without that intentionality or that attention to detail, Ramadan will pass right by. I mean, think about Sha'ban. We just announced the beginning of Sha'ban, it seemed like last week, and here we are right at the tail end of it. Ramadan will pass right by, and we will not have achieved what we set out to do. We might not have achieved anything, and it will end up being a lost opportunity. Brothers and sisters, so while often we do think about iftar, and we think about suhoor and the food that we're going to have and the time we're going to spend with each other as community members or within our own household as family, we need to put some real thought into what we want to achieve in terms of our spiritual growth and development this month. We have to ask ourselves questions here to kind of map this out. How are we going to avoid sin? Think about that. Are you going to take time off the internet? Are you going to take time away from the TV? These are some questions you can ask yourselves. Are you going to sign out of your social media accounts? I mean, let's be honest. The stuff that we see, we might not even go in there trying to see some of that stuff, but guess what? They feed it to us anyway. They give it to us regardless if you want it or you don't want it, you're going to get it. Are you going to perhaps avoid certain people? You know, that they drag you into certain types of conversations or bring up certain subject matter you know is just taboo? Are you going to perhaps discuss some of the sinful habits that you may have developed within your own home and talk to your family about how we're going to stop doing this? We're going to avoid these things altogether? How are you going to increase your good deeds this month? What's the plan? Are you going to schedule extra time for prayer? Are you going to look for and identify opportunities to increase charitable spending? Are you going to make time to volunteer for righteous causes? Are you going to perhaps feed, not yourself, but others for iftar? How are you going to refine your character? This may be one of the most challenging goals of the month. Refining the character is something that you have to impose on yourself. To be more patient, it just doesn't come naturally. Many of us would say, look, I'm just not a patient person. I'm a hot-headed person. I have a temper. I'm quick to react. And then just excuse yourself. But the reality is, character has to be refined, and you're the one that has to do it. You have to impose these things on yourself. So what are you going to do to reform your character? Being more mindful of your temper, perhaps? Being more conscious about where you are in terms of about to explode or not quite yet? How are you going to increase your patience with others? Will you try being more compassionate and sympathetic, trying to be more understanding perhaps of the people around you in order to deal better with them? And then how are you going to keep your heart focused on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala throughout the day and the night? Are you going to remember to make dhikr throughout the day? Are you going to have something to remind you to do so? Are you going to spend time with His book, reading and reciting, studying the verses, contemplating over the meanings? Are you going to find the right place and environment which will remove the distractions that we're often plagued with in order to do that? These are all questions that we have to ask if we're going to set a plan in place to achieve our goals. If we haven't answered these questions, brothers and sisters, and given Ramadan some real thought yet, as I said, we're less than 10 days away, and now's the time in order to take advantage of that month, to take advantage also of what the community is offering in support of your positive Ramadan experience. Now's the time, brothers and sisters. Take a moment today or this weekend, make a plan. Put a plan in place. And inshallah, you will have a successful Ramadan. We ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala continue to pardon and to forgive, that He guide us to the straight way. We ask that He bless us in the remaining days of Sha'ban, and that He grant us an amazing Ramadan in which we will become better worshipers and stronger believers. We also ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala relieve our brothers and sisters struggling around the world, those that are suffering and those that are oppressed, especially those that are in Gaza. We ask that He grant salvation and victory to all of our brothers and sisters in Palestine. Many of you should know that this past week has been a deadly week for our brothers and sisters there. Just yesterday, more than 100 Palestinian aid seekers, meaning they're looking for humanitarian aid, were shot and killed. 100, more than 100, and at least 750 were left wounded by the Israeli occupation forces when they opened fire on a crowd of people waiting for food trucks to be delivered to them. They're already starving, as we've discussed. They're already using food as a weapon. And now when they're rallying to receive those food trucks, it's open season. So we ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put a swift end to their operations, those of the Israeli occupation forces, that He liberate our brothers and sisters from the oppression of His enemies, because certainly we should know that these are the enemies of Allah. وصلى الله وسلم على نبينا محمد وآخر دعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين.